Cool. Again, thank you all so much for being here. And we're here to continue our 12-week odyssey with this massive, Bible of a book that we, as you know, for those who maybe are newer to the space, are not familiar with how seriously we take this book at Abolition School. It's really central to our understanding. And part of what we're doing in these 12 weeks is to dig through why it's so important to understanding not only the history of the United States, but our contemporary moment, the way that we read Black Reconstruction as a guide and a practical guide for action in the present, for analyzing, understanding, and acting today. And we're moving on to really the action piece of the text as we get into week 4. But first, as usual, as always, I should say, we want to engage in a little bit of recapping. We want to think about what the conversations we had last week in our analysis of chapter 3 on the planter class. And as you can see, there's some pieces up here. We talked about the ways in which the Southern planter class in the United States had concentrated power in its hands, right? This is Du Bois talking about and analyzing the 7% of the US South that had managed to accumulate and monopolize almost all power in its own hands. And he talked about the ways in which the planter class did that. And specifically, he emphasized the ways in which there had been a systematic and undemocratic dispossession of power from all sectors of society in the US South, but specifically the complicity of the 3/5 compromise, which, if people remember from last time, we talked about some of the misconceptions about how the 3/5 compromise operates historically. And we really want to emphasize the fact, as Du Bois does, that the part of the point of the 3/5 compromise was not to actually underrepresent enslaved Black Americans in the US South. It was an attempt by the planters to overrepresent this population because that was more representation that they got to claim, right? So what it did was inflated their power, and it inflated their ability to further dispossess and disenfranchise poor white people in the South, right? So both things are happening at the same time, and it was really by disenfranchising both of these classes that the planters were able to maintain their power for so long as this sort of landed oligarchy. We talked about the ways in which the material conditions of the economic structure in the US South and of the slave system had huge implications that Du Bois emphasizes for the realm of what we could call culture or ideology, the way that people think, the kind of people that they were, and that was incredibly important for understanding, according to Du Bois, the trap that the planter class ended up being caught in. They were caught in an economic contradiction, if you recall, and they were not, as Du Bois understood it, the right people to figure their way out of that. In other words, the way that they thought, the way that they understood themselves, and their kind of self-delusions about their own power played a huge role in driving the South toward war. On the economic level, the Southern planter did not control the broader market forces that determined the value, say, of the cotton that they were producing and selling. So they thought of themselves as being so important to the global economy, and yet it was it was Northern bankers, it was Northern capitalists that were running the banks, that were running the shipping, and that were ultimately running the whole context into which those raw materials were being delivered. And this created situations in a context in which it was very difficult, actually, paradoxically, for the planter to discipline enslaved people. We talked about the kind of counterintuitive way in which, when you have a system that runs purely on violence, violence is the only mechanism you have to discipline labor, right? You can't fire that labor, you can't replace them with other labor. You have a situation in which you have to be constantly and permanently disciplining, and at a certain point, that makes it impossible to actually increase productivity in the way that the planter needed to. And so as a result, finally, the last ditch attempt by the US planter in the South was to try to move westward, to try to claim more space in more states for a slave plantation economy. And of course, this is part of what comes up against the political competition from the North and from the non-slave states. It creates conflict in Kansas, and it creates an entire sort of powder keg of tension that ultimately explodes. This propelled all of these tensions, and the fact, again, that the that the planter, according to Du Bois, could not understand and grasp that situation, was too stubborn, was too self-important, was, as he put it, a petty kinglet, someone who took themselves incredibly seriously, who was decadent both in the way that they consumed, but also decadent in how they understood their own power. This all led the planter to, as Du Bois puts it, commit suicide by civil war. Right? And if we remember, these first 3 chapters are analyzing the class composition of the U.S. South. The black worker, the white worker, and the planter. This is the chapter 4 on the general strike, when this constellation gets set into motion. Right? This is incredibly important for Du Bois. He's engaged in an analysis of the class constellation, and this is the moment where he puts it in motion. Right? And we're going to ask a lot of questions about how it enters into motion, who sets it into motion, and therefore who has that kind of power to do that. Right? This kind of motion, you'll often hear me or others use this term, we call it dialectical, right? When these clashes and contradictions and conflicts come into contact with each other and they begin pushing and driving, at and beyond each other. This is part of what is driving history, and this is a huge part of how we understand this moment of the outbreak of the war. Now, I asked you all to look at chapter 4 with a specific attention to the question of meaning. And that may seem like a slightly strange thing to say and to ask when we're talking about a chapter that is fundamentally about action, right? This is about a general strike. It's about a moment in which enslaved people enter into action, engage in radical action. So why all of this talk about meaning? But fundamentally, the question is, of course, was the Civil War about slavery? What did the Civil War mean? And implicit in that is the question is, was this a war about slavery? And how do we understand the dynamic that brings it into being one? The answer is actually not a simple one. And it's not one that can be understood outside of that dynamic motion. So if we go over to the, as usual, as always, the chapter summary, we begin with this sort of meditation on what the chapter summary offers, this condensed sort of piece here, which I'll read in its entirety really quickly, how the Civil War meant emancipation and how the black worker won the war by a general strike, which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force. Now, notice here that the chapter summary, just like every other chapter summary, begins with the word how. And that's a very interesting thing to begin with. And it seems a little redundant. Why would Du Bois not just say the Civil War meant emancipation, right? Why does each chapter summary, and I've asked this I think before, why does each chapter summary begin with the word how? And it's in part because what Du Bois is trying to explain in every chapter is quite literally how this motion emerges, right? How it is that the Civil War comes to be about emancipation. And so the task for him is not simply to describe this, but to understand the how of it and the how that we arrive on these kind of shifting grounds of meaning. And note, of course, very crucially here that he says how the black worker won the war, right? That's a super, of course, explosive contribution that he's making. It's a huge undercurrent and thread of the way this narrative is going to play out. And it's one that we're definitely it's a thought that we're definitely going to want to hold on to. Now, as we said, we're talking a lot about meaning. And what's very interesting about this chapter, as you may have noticed, we're going to spend a lot of time on this first page, in part because there's so much happening. And Du Bois argues and shows and begins with this story of Edward Ruffin. When Edward Ruffin, white-haired and mad, fired the first gun at Fort Sumter, he freed the slaves. And this is an accident. It says, it was the last thing he meant to do. But that was because he was so typically a Southern oligarch. He did not know the real world about him. So Ruffin, this is Fort Sumter. Essentially what had happened in the historical trajectory is that in December 1860, Southern states begin to secede. We talked last time about the elements that drove them toward that kind of secession, but they begin to secede. At a certain point, the Confederacy surrounds Fort Sumter and begins to besiege Union troops there. And Ruffin is an arch secessionist who actually would later himself commit suicide along with his cause. And he was reputed to have fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, meaning this is the moment that the Civil War becomes kind of a hot war. There had already been the secession. This is when the hot war begins. Now, Du Bois doesn't say that Ruffin accidentally started the war, because that's exactly what he knew he was doing, right? That's what he meant to do. He says he accidentally freed the slaves, which was definitely not what he meant to do. And part of what's so curious about Du Bois saying this is that it's nearly 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. So what we're going to map out again in this chapter is how is it that he could say that this moment led to the freedom of the slaves or meant the freedom of the slaves already? And what does it mean to call it an accident? The first thing that Du Bois does is this very, very Marxist thing of dealing with the question of an individual, in this case Ruffin, in relation to his class by making him a representative, right? He says, he was so typically a Southern oligarch. What does that mean? Again, this is very similar to what he had said in the last chapter on the planter. What does it mean to be a Southern oligarch? Du Bois writes, he did not know the real world about him. He was provincial and lived apart on his plantation with his servants, his books, and his thoughts. Outside of agriculture, he jumped at conclusions instead of testing them by careful research. He knew, for instance, that the North would not fight. He knew that Negroes would never revolt. It's interesting, right? It's an accident because he, as a representative of his class, did not understand the world, right? Again, this is very characteristic for Du Bois of the planter. And so we're beginning with an accident, we're beginning with this question of meaning, and we're also beginning with the question of what Ruffin knew and what he knew was not true, right? So he's fundamentally mired in a kind of contradiction. Okay, second paragraph. And so war came. War is murder, force, anarchy, and debt. Its end is evil despite all incidental good. He says the North and the South, no one meant to go to war, no one was planning to go to war, no one had prepared for war. And then we skip to the third paragraph. And this is what's really crucial. When Northern armies entered the South, they became armies of emancipation. What on earth is happening? When they entered the South, they became armies of emancipation, right? The meaning of the Northern armies changed as soon as they entered the U.S. South. And then he continues, it was the last thing they planned to be. The North did not propose to attack property. It did not propose to free the slaves. This was to be a white man's war to preserve the Union, and the Union must be preserved. This is just the third paragraph. There's so much going on here. It's absolutely chaotic. Some of the things that are going on here, though, are the way in which, in a general sense, events overtake meaning, right? Events outpace the ideas that are in theory and allegedly kind of behind them. They transform them. But we're also looking at a very specific form of misunderstanding that I often refer to as a colonial blind spot or as racial hubris, where specifically the powerful and those who are empowered and on top of systems of racial domination are unable to see what's happening, right? They're incapable of knowing things, right? This is why Ruffin could not see, for example, the fact that enslaved Black people would resist, the fact that they would walk off the job. And so this is one, piece of what's happening. But there also, again, is this generalized way in which when events like this are set into motion, it's very hard to keep up with them, right? And the concepts and the ideas, again, in people's minds that are motivating them, that are setting them into motion, are overtaken by those events themselves. They become transformed. They gain new kind of content. So these are some pieces that we need to really try to keep in mind when we're thinking about the way that these armies, as soon as they marched into the South, gained a new meaning and gained a meaning that they did not intend to have, right? This is, incredibly, incredibly interesting what Du Bois is saying already. Why was the Union not for abolition? Why were these not armies of emancipation from the beginning? We've all been told the story about the Civil War being a war to abolish slavery. Of course, that was not what it was, right? That was not what it was meant to be. And Du Bois is really emphasizing this fact. They were not for abolition because, as Du Bois puts it, and this is at the bottom of the page, not 1/10 of the northern white population would have fought for any such purpose. In other words, 90% of the North would have been opposed to any war to free enslaved people. This was a non-starter on a political level, even in the North, of course, much more so in the South. He quotes Douglass a few pages later. This is a later speech by Frederick Douglass where he says, the South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North was fighting to keep it in the Union, both despising the Negro, both insulting the Negro, right? It bears repeating because we still hear resonances of this mythology today, right? We still are told that the war was to free the slaves. We still are told, and we'll get to this by the end of the chapter, of course, that Lincoln himself was responsible for the freedom of enslaved people when that is not true. And it all begins with this dynamic moment, right? Where the sort of constellation, again, is set into motion, right? So how do we get from no one wanting abolition to the war itself being about abolition? Not only being about it, but as Du Bois says, how the Civil War meant emancipation, right? How do we bridge that gap? This is one of the questions. This is actually the fundamental question that we're going to be tracking in the course of this chapter. We've seen the ways that the South couldn't compromise. The South was propelled into this conflict with the North. Again, that didn't mean that the conflict would be necessarily over slavery, at least from the understanding that both sides brought to the conflict. But deep down on a fundamental level, as Du Bois puts it, both sides knew slavery was due, right? He's trying to speak to what is known and what is unknown at the same time. He says this very, very peculiar thing. This is over on the top of 57. He's mapping out the different ways in which the North and the South ignored the workers, ignored poor white people. Both sides ignored black people, free and enslaved. As he puts it, both sections ignored the Negro. Despite the fact that they were, as Du Bois puts it, central to this drama, despite the fact that they existed on center stage, as he puts it, they occupied the center of the stage because of simple physical reasons. They were at the heart of this system, and yet everyone ignored them, right? And then he says on the top of 57, only John Brown knew just how revolt had come and would come, and he was dead. Again, belaboring this point a little bit about knowledge, he's literally saying only John Brown, only those rebels, the abolitionists who really took up arms and decided to fight against the system, they were the only ones who could really see the way this was going to go down, right? Even that is a little misleading, right? I mean, it's not misleading in the sense that it's true in retrospect, but John Brown's action, in other words, the attack on Harper's Ferry, the raid on Harper's Ferry, was part of what set this dynamic moving, right? And he'd already said that. So it's, if John Brown was dedicated to this path and this struggle, that's true, but it wasn't until after his action, in which he sacrificed himself, that the dynamic begins to really move with some, cadence. Now we're all building up to this question of what enslaved people themselves knew. And Du Bois is making a very interesting intervention here, because when he's saying only John Brown knew, he's actually being kind of serious about that. He turns to what it is that enslaved people knew and thought and understood. He's turning, in other words, to this question of what kind of consciousness you could impute. This is a very common kind of Marxist framework of thinking about the structural relationship of a class, in this case, the black worker, and to think about the ways in which we can assume a certain kind of consciousness, or a development of consciousness, or coalescence of maybe a class identity, or a sort of framework that allows people to then think consciously and act, right? This is what I mean when I say something like imputed class consciousness. But when Du Bois is turning to what kind of consciousness he's sort of seeing in and analyzing in enslaved people at the time, he isn't doing so to say that he believes that enslaved people knew everything, or understood the situation perfectly, or acted in a conscious way, right? And again, we can think back to the ways in which Du Bois from the very beginning is saying he's not trying to claim that enslaved people were angels, or that they were anything but, as he puts it, ordinary human beings. So he's looking at ordinary human beings in their context, looking at how they acted, and trying to draw lessons on how they responded to the circumstances that they confronted. What were those circumstances? If we look over on this is on page 57, again, right in the middle of page 57. Du Bois writes, "It must be borne in mind that nine-tenths of the 4 million black slaves could neither read nor write, and that the overwhelming majority of them were isolated on country plantations. Any mass movement under such circumstances must materialize slowly and painfully." Any mass movement, right? Again, he's not talking specifically about enslaved black people. He's saying any mass movement that emerges under these conditions. What are these conditions? Relatively low literacy and geographically dispersed, right? Again, these are old debates. A lot of these debates historically are about the peasantry, right? The reasons that, say, Marxists identify the proletariat as being more radical and potentially radical is because it exists in a compressed way in factories, sitting next to each other, being subjected to the same kind of discipline, and therefore developing and communicating a class understanding and a class identity, right? And Marxists for a long time said most peasants, specifically though they meant dispersed, they mostly meant landowning, small landowning kind of peasantry, were less radical because they existed so far from one another and they did not exist under these same uniform kind of conditions, right? So it's harder to develop an understanding, an analysis, a conscious strategy. So he's doing something very classic, and it's not a very specific, it's not specific to enslaved people, this analysis that he's kind of offering. What this means in this context is that he's pushing back on two prevailing theories, which are either that enslaved people were the first to leave slavery, the first to walk off the plantation, or that they were the last, right? They were loyal, they were faithful, they waited and protected their masters. Neither of those is true, according to Du Bois, and neither actually fits with a sort of structural relationship to the situation that they confronted. What was it that enslaved people did when Union armies entered the South? This is what he writes. What the Negro did was to wait, look, and listen, and try to see where his interest lay. There was no use in seeking refuge in an army which was not an army of freedom. And again, the Northern armies were saying, we are not an army of freedom. And so there's no use seeking refuge with them. And there was no sense in revolting against armed masters who were conquering the world. So waiting, watching, keeping an eye on the situation, analyzing it. As soon, however, as it became clear that the Union armies would not or could not return fugitive slaves, and that the masters, with all of their fume and fury, were uncertain of victory, the slave entered upon a general strike against slavery by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. He ran away to the first place of safety and offered his services to the Federal Army, so that in this way it was really true that he served his former master and served the emancipating army. And it was also true that this withdrawal and bestowal of his labor decided the war. This is a really central paragraph. The way he puts it later on, he says, they crouched consciously and moved silently, listening, hoping, and hesitating, right? So again, neither the first to jump into action, right? Nor were they beholden to the system to the degree that they would stay and wait and defend it. Of course not, right? But like any other human being, for Du Bois, the question was one of understanding the situation, looking for where their interest might best be served, and then acting. But what's very interesting and very peculiar is that when they acted with this really tremendous degree of coordination and unison. the general strike against slavery by the same methods he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. The general strike is anchored in flight. It's anchored in marronage, the escape from slavery, the flight north, the Underground Railroad, but it becomes something far more generalized, right? And again, it does so in a context that doesn't have high rates of literacy, in a context in which there isn't a great deal of communication between these sort of dispersed plantations. This was the general strike, right? And we're talking in the end about up to 500,000 enslaved people walking off the plantation, walking to and crowding around Union encampments, first becoming laborers and then becoming ultimately spies and soldiers, and again, determining the outcome of the war and with it, the meaning, right? This is why we're talking about meaning. This general strike, this mass action is the origin and the source of this transformation of the outcome of the war and what the war meant. Again, there's something very peculiar here because he's saying that folks were waiting to see where their interest lay and if these armies were emancipating armies before they fled and before they joined them. But they're not actually emancipating armies until after they join them, right? So there's this mass, spontaneous transformation happening, and the source of that transformation, again, is the self-activity of enslaved people. He says the Negro spoiled it, meaning the Southern plans, spoiled it in a perfectly logical way. And yet the logic is very difficult to pin down. He also describes the general strike and the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people around Union encampments as a swarm, right? Swarm is not an image that we associate with logic, right? If anything, it's a long-standing image in the history of philosophy and political thought, from Hegel to the Fable of the Bees, this very famous sort of proto-capitalist text by Mandeville. It's this figure for trying to conceptualize how irrational action becomes rational, right? And Du Bois is really doing something very, very similar because he's trying to explain a spontaneous action that gains a collective valence, right? That we can understand as a general strike, despite the fact that there's no organization calling for it, there's no one planning it, there's no newspapers being distributed talking about it, and yet it's still, for Du Bois, a general strike. He even speaks in terms of, and this was a sort of almost like a term of paranoia that had been used by slave owners, what he calls a spiritual telegraph or a mysterious spiritual telegraph. It's often referred to as an underground telegraph, like the Underground Railroad. The Underground Telegraph being a communication means that no one can see, right? Slave owners would be confused and surprised and say, well, how is it that folks that live 100 miles away from each other are passing information to each other so quickly? So there are sort of subterranean means of communication that are being developed. And there is a level of consciousness on a certain level that's being generalized. That's clear, right? That's obvious in the mode of the action. And yet it's difficult for Du Bois to sort of pin down how that is happening. There's this great passage on, where was this? 64. The arrival among us of these hordes was like the oncoming of cities. There was no plan in this exodus, no Moses to lead it. Unlettered reason or the mere inarticulate decision of instinct brought them to us. Right? The contradictions in the descriptions are very powerful, right? Unlettered reason, okay. Inarticulate decision of instinct. No Moses to lead, no plan. And yet the plan is manifesting in the process. It's very interesting. Like, again, you've got a generalized question and you've got a very specific question when it comes to understanding and the failure and the impossibility of understanding resistance from enslaved people in particular, colonized people more broadly. This is said very often and famously of the Haitian Revolution, which is that it was unthinkable, right? And it was especially unthinkable for the French because they were on top of the system. They couldn't understand how these sort of what they understood to be subhuman people were able to plan and organize an army and resist and fight and create a sort of free society. But then there was also a second element, which is that even within the Haitian Revolution, the praxis sort of got out ahead of the conceptualization, if that makes sense, right? There is something spontaneous happening. People are not exactly sure what their broad and overarching objective is outside of, in this case, as Du Bois puts it, the same thing that motivated the fugitive slave, right? I'm going to leave. Hundreds of thousands of individuals doing the same thing at the same time, according to the same relationship with the structure of the system. That's what Du Bois is really trying to identify. And it's not just enslaved people, right? He says poor whites were fleeing. He says there's all of these people who were fed up with the system, who were fed up with this war, who are moving toward these lines. And he also pushes back, if people probably caught this piece, on the, he's playing, this role of pushing back a little bit on the idea that there was retribution, on the idea that there was revenge or there was violence, because a huge amount of the narrative, the contradictory narrative of the slave system, was to say that on the one hand, enslaved people were happy, and on the other hand, they were bloodthirsty and violent, right? These are in permanent contradiction because they reflect a contradiction that the system can't resolve and that the individual slave owner can't resolve, right? So Du Bois is saying on the one hand, no, there was no real retribution, right? There were cases, many cases of enslaved people actually protecting, vulnerable people in their households, right? Women, children, yes. And then he makes this very peculiar statement where he says, human nature does not, this is on 66, human nature does not deliberately choose blood, at least not black human nature. And he's being a little coy there, right? Because he doesn't understand this to be a biological question, but he does understand it to be a question of, again, what it means to exist as black in this social structure, right? A situation in which the call was not to engage in or inflict unnecessary violence, but to leave the system, right? And to leave the system in a manner that led to its transformation. So we've got this very interesting piece about the motivation of the general strike, what it looks like, the spontaneity that's built into it, and the way that that general strike, despite all of this, because of this mass outpouring of hundreds of thousands of people leaving the plantation, and we'll get to the sort of mechanical pieces of how that plays out in a minute, how it sets into motion a broader transformation of meaning, right? I want to take a couple minutes, though, to take questions from y'all in the room before we get on to the sort of second piece of our conversation. And if there are questions on the chat as well, those can be brought in. But if there are any things that people want to pull out of here, again, specifically thinking about this question of the emergence of the general strike and the shift of the meaning of the war.
I know you're not like a civil war. Thank you. Yeah, this might be getting too much into like this actual Civil War history, but I feel like towards the beginning of the chapter, he's talking about the beginning of the war as like a dress parade and like the lack of intention on either side. I'm just curious if you could provide like more historical context to like what he's getting at with that.
Sorry, do you mean the fact that no one expected it to be a war?
Yeah.
I mean, I think literally no one expected it to be a war. And again, so there's a couple pieces. I don't want to sort of downplay the importance of the question, but I think it was incredibly shocking, right? It was shocking that the South would secede. And yet we've seen, again, Du Bois goes out of his way to map out and chart the ways in which the consciousness of the planter had become so truncated that there's no way for them to conceive of anything else, right? And their inflated ego economic ego, sort of sectional ego, you could put it that way. Their self-importance as a class was delusional, right? They misunderstood the importance of the commodity they were providing to be the center of the economy. And they couldn't conceive, because of who they were, of an alternative to slavery as a system. And there were very real, reasons for that, right? Part of it was psychological, but again, part of it was material, right? Slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise and the sort of disenfranchisement it provided was part of what kept the poor, the poor white sector of the South disenfranchised and complacent, right? And the different alternatives that the planter could have engaged in ran the risk of raising the question again of what a unified, maybe class struggle might look like, right? Again, Du Bois says the way forward would have been for the planter to voluntarily embrace abolition and the gradual incorporation of something like a system of wage labor, right? However, not only was that, unthinkable to them, it was also true that to do so would have created a reaction from poor whites, right? That then would have had to be managed, right? So these are some of the contradictions that are kind of emerging. I mean, on the side of the North, I don't think anyone thought that again, from the perspective of the North, which is often to say from the perspective of capital, it didn't make sense for the South to do what it did, and therefore there's like a lack of expectation that it might actually do it, right? So I think it's very, very true. And again, if we think back to the previous chapters, the sort of flashpoint is John Brown's, raid on Harper's Ferry, which coincides with and comes, in conjunction with Lincoln's election, right? And the main thing there is not that he was against slavery, because he was not. The main thing there is that he was against the expansion of slavery westward, right? Which would have shut off this sort of expansion of more land, dedication of more land to this labor. And the third piece was this extra large bumper crop of cotton, right? Which gave the southern states the idea that they could go it alone.
Is the colonial blind spot purely epistemic, economic, political, or all of the above?
Okay, so the question is about the colonial blind spot. This is something I reference in a book called Anti-Colonial Eruptions, and it speaks about the ways in which systems of power create and build into themselves forms of blindness that leads them to specifically underestimate oppressed people, poor people, and more specifically and more particularly oppressed people of color, right? Again, the main mechanism of this is building a system. If you picture it this way, if you build a system based on racial exclusion and dehumanization, part of what you're saying to justify and legitimize that system, as we've seen very clearly in this case, is that the people that you're subjecting to slavery are not fully human. They don't really understand freedom. They're not able to conceive of what it would mean to fight back or resist. They're biologically suited to this kind of work or condition or unfreedom. And so at a certain point, what happens is that those in power begin to believe the things that they've told themselves about oppressed people, right? About racialized people. That's where the blind spot kind of emerges, right? And so it's built into the economic, but emerges very much in a sort of epistemological, meaning knowledge, but even bigger than that, right? Ontological. When we say ontological, we mean the level of being, right? Is this person fully human? Do they fully exist, right? And race is a system of dehumanization, which is to say a system of ontological disqualification, right? If you're racialized, it means you're grouped into categories that are less and less human than the full category of humanity. And so it's not, I don't think it's simple enough to say that it's not economic, that it's purely ideological. It's not, it's built into material reality. It is a lived material reality. And this is where a lot of the kind of like class first analysis, I think, falls flat, because it says things like, well, class is real and material and race is not real and material, except for the fact that like when people are walking down the street and they, occupy different racial positions, there are material consequences to that, right? So like, how is that not a material thing? So that's part of, I think, what I would say about that. And the sort of colonial blind spot is part of this sort of contradiction. It's very tightly related to this contradiction of thinking, or trying to the slave master trying to convince themselves that slaves are happy, right? And try to convince themselves that the slave owner is a patriarchal father, is a caring figure. All of these stories they try to tell themselves to justify the system make them less able to understand the weaknesses of that system, and it contributes to the delusion.
Cool. Well, I also had another example to answer your question. Is like in the white political power structure, one really, like, when we look back on stuff, we're like, duh, this was going to happen. But one thing that really did that set this off was like a signal, but people didn't receive it correctly, was when Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death in Congress by a pro-slavery congressperson. And that congressperson, whose name I'm forgetting, was convicted of assault. And so that was like a resolution to this broaching of like the political like norms or whatever. So that was resolved to them in a way that made it so that they were like, okay, well, thank God that was like just like a random like outburst and crazy thing that happened, but now we can move on with business as usual. But when we look back on that, that was like a clear and that Charles Sumner was like an ardent abolitionist. He wasn't just some kind of like regular like northern capitalist. So he was really preaching the abolitionist screed, and the reaction to that was so strong. I mean, he really nearly died in that attack. So I feel like that's also like a useful example of like how these folks were thinking about stuff, is that like this outburst or this like impolite and violent moment was resolved in a way that they felt they could move on from, even though they were barreling into war, essentially. And I had a separate question, which was, I was kind of curious to hear a little bit of your thoughts, or anybody's thoughts, on sort of like, it was really interesting to read the excerpts from newspapers, and like sort of like the self-propagandization and the self-delusion that is going on in there, as well as like, it's also like a useful, the word I would use is like psyops, where like you could assume that like northern military and political people are reading the southern stuff and like just trying like sort of like the fog of war through print in a way. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about that, because I found those pieces very interesting. It's like delusional, but also it probably served a purpose for them to articulate these, like, we're so strong and we have this huge thing. It's like they probably believed it, but they also knew they had to articulate that to hopefully win the war, so to speak.
Yeah, no, and I'll start with the second point. I think it's a great point, right? Which is, it's got everything to do with this attempt to manage a cognitive dissonance, right? Which is to say, on some level, everyone knew this was unsustainable. On some level, everyone knew there was a crisis coming, and yet, and we've seen when it comes to the broader functioning of race, right? Meaning the way that it's constructed and reinforced over time and in certain moments, that it was when the system was threatened that it became more important, right? Again, it's like any hegemonic structure, right? To use the sort of Gramscian language, which is when the system itself is threatened, there needs to be this other layer of ideological justification that enters in to uphold it, right? And so what you saw over time was that the more slave rebellions happened, the more powerful the narrative had to be that slaves were happy and would not rebel, right? And so it's a very counterintuitive thing, but it makes sense when you think about these ideological structures as existing to uphold and strengthen the system, right? But again, part of what they do is to paper over the contradictions, right? Which gets to your first point, which is the way in which, and this feels very familiar to us, right? Sumner was a sort of, one of the most important abolitionist orators in the House, and he's nearly beaten to death with a sort of like adorned walking stick, right? It's got like a golden something on, I forget. But it's one of those things that happens, and then I think we're very familiar with the ways in which these things are sort of like go down the memory hole, right? And they're sort of particularized. We act as if this was just a weird thing that happened, right? And it doesn't have a systemic importance. But what happens is that, and this is the very first thing you said, I think, which is that in retrospect, it all makes sense, right? In retrospect, these things are so obvious. And this is what got me thinking about this idea of the colonial blind spot from the beginning. It was specifically stuff in Venezuela where you're like, oh, like this thing happened in 1989 where there's a mass rebellion against dramatic inequality and poverty. And everyone was shocked when it happened. But in retrospect, of course, it was going to happen. Right? And that's exactly what's happening here, right? Which is that everyone knows on some level, and yet there are all of these powerful psychological attempts to resolve that contradiction and tension, right? The difficulty for us is to be able to do that in the moment, right? I mean, I think most of the folks in the room here know that a terrifying contradiction is coming, right? And that it's going to be, years of lead and very difficult and painful years coming because of the depth of that contradiction and the reorientation of the system that's happening right now, right? But for many people, it's hard to see beyond the kind of static, right? And to really see the historical movement and the motion. And that's what Du Bois is trying to sort of allow us to see in retrospect. We have a couple more in the chat, and then we'll maybe get back to this, and we'll save some more questions for the end.
So from the chat, the point that Du Bois makes on 57 about how enslaved people waited to see their best option before running to Union Army lines. What did that process look like in the slaveholding Union states?
What did the process look like of waiting and watching? Yeah, I mean, it kind of looked like that. And it's very interesting to think about, right? Because it's very obvious in a certain way. Du Bois, part of what he's saying when he said there's no retribution and no revenge, he's also saying there's no insurrection. It's not a huge insurrectionary movement. But he says it's not like Haiti. He said it wasn't a massive sort of insurrectionary war that was happening. But the reason he gives is kind of obvious, right? Which is that it wasn't necessary, right? It was much less risky to simply flee and head to the Union armies at that point, right? So again, we're talking about the ways that Du Bois is anchoring individual decisions in the structure that they confront, right? Every individual confronting this question, what do I do in this moment, right? Looking at what's happening, talking to others, of course, but also calculating on their own. And that calculation is very different when the Union armies are 10 miles away, right? And so that's part of what he's saying, right? Is that this sort of spontaneity that we're seeing is the fact that hundreds of thousands of people made similar decisions around the same time, right? But, that's, precisely what it looked like, right? What's, an interesting aspect that I always find about this that I didn't think about until probably, pretty recently, is the fact that this general strike is very much a story. At least at the beginning, it's very much a story that's occurring in only specific parts of the South, right? In other words, it's where the Union armies are, which leads to maybe a slightly distorted vision of what's happening in the rest of the area, right? And so there's an unevenness, according to which different areas kind of fall, armies march, Sherman's march then comes through, right? And so you see similar dynamics in each moment, but he'll talk later on in the state-by-state Reconstruction chapters about the fact that in the sort of like downriver, more sort of extreme sort of southwestern parts of the South, there were entire regions in which people didn't know they were free, right? In which they had been prevented from knowing that, in which the armies hadn't arrived, and so the structure had not transformed, right? So we are talking about something that emerges and unfolds in a very, very uneven way. Cool. Awesome. So we're going to go on and just say a couple more things about what this looked like, right? We've already kind of suggested the way in which part of what makes this chapter so central is the fact that the general strike is the moment where the class constellation enters into motion, right? Where it's set into motion. And the source of that motion is the enslaved people themselves, right? In other words, it's not the Southern planter that really starts it. It's not the Northern capitalist. It's the enslaved people themselves that through this general strike, through this mass action, are capable of transforming meaning and transforming the outcome of the war. They hold the future of the war in their hands. Now, this is peculiar because At the outset of the war, it seemed as if the South had a very specific strategic advantage, which was namely the fact that they could fight a war, in other words, with white soldiers, and still put food on the table, right? Because they were making use of a pool of enslaved black labor. And on top of that, they could sell cotton on the international market as a way to fund the war, right? This seemed like a dramatic advantage. It seemed like the advantage that from the beginning made it very doubtful that the Union could actually win the war. But the first thing that the general strike does is to completely invert that, right? As soon as hundreds of thousands of people leave the fields, leave the point of production in agricultural labor, what happens is that there's a crisis, right? Either white people who are currently serving the army and fighting come back to run the farms, or there's no food, right? Or there's no resources. So the first thing that happens, and the first sort of powerful decisiveness of this, is the strategic centrality of black labor during the Civil War, right? That's a key piece. And he had alluded to this, right? He had said that this is the building block of the entirety of global capitalism. At this point, we've talked about racial capitalism as a way of understanding how different modes, or what are apparently different modes of production, coexist, right? Slavery producing cotton. The cotton is being sent into an apparently capitalist system in the US North for textile sort of manufacturing. All of that is generating a broader system that operates through the inequality of those different forms, right? So you've got the centrality of enslaved labor. And this is very key because it's something that doesn't last, right? This is something that when you get to the 20th century, you begin having different conversations and different strategic, analysis about. As Du Bois puts it, this is on 79, I think. The position of the Negro was strategic. Without their labor, the South would starve. Without their labor, the South would starve. With 3.5 million, with arms in their hands, Negroes would form a fighting force which could replace every single northern white soldier fighting listlessly and against his will with a black man fighting for freedom. So there you have the second piece, right? Namely the fact that the next step, in theory at least, although we're going to go through the way that this plays out and the long debates involved to getting to this point, those who fled to the Union Army lines, again, first were laborers, then were scouts, then were spies, and then ultimately were soldiers, right? But as Du Bois puts it, being a soldier meant becoming free. Being a soldier meant becoming free. And there's different and very sort of powerfully important ways and complicated ways that we'll talk about in the next couple chapters about why that is the case. Third, the general strike transformed and generalized abolition as a framework, right? We talked about the fact that 9/10 of the North was opposed to abolition. That changes incredibly quickly. This is a lesson that's important for contemporary abolitionists to bear in mind because it speaks to a moment in which abolition, in this case of slavery, went from being very unpopular to much, much more popular over the period of just a couple of years, right? We know that these systems are not eternal, but there's a way in which they are horizons that sort of cloud out all other possibilities until they break, right? And they can break very, very quickly. And different alternatives begin to emerge, and different ways of looking at the world become sort of apparent. But it's always important to bear in mind the fact that these systems can change very, very quickly, depending on who's pushing and with what level of kind of fanaticism. The general strike weakened what Du Bois calls the virus of racism, and even in the US South. There was an attempt to double down on it and to reinforce it. Why? Because they had to keep poor whites in the army. They had to try to figure out a way to convince these poor people to fight a rich man's war, and yet it breaks down. And Du Bois charts this breaking down by identifying the ways in which poor whites were also fleeing. Right? They were also leaving. They were also, even if they weren't for equality, they were not for the war, and they were abandoning the war effort. This is on 81. He writes, the poor white not only began to desert and run away, but thousands followed the Negro into the northern camps, right? So these were not just camps of formerly enslaved people. They were multiracial mass camps that were developing and building around the Union armies. The general strike also, and especially if we're beginning to think about what it meant, Du Bois is very clear, and this will become even more important as it kind of, as the argument plays out. He's doing a couple of things. He's saying it was clear that people were willing to work, right? It was clear that people wanted to work. And we want to be very careful about what it is that he means here. Because on the one hand, he's pushing back on these sort of arguments, and we talked about this before in framing the book, about corruption or about inefficiency or about laziness, right? This idea of this sort of biological laziness that Du Bois insists is part of the system itself, a manifestation of a system in which you're not being paid to do labor at all. And so why would you do labor? And so on the one hand, he's trying to compensate for that. He's saying, listen, no, like as soon as people were free, they wanted to work, right? They wanted to labor, right? But at the same time, he was also being very careful about the fact that he was talking about what they were looking for, what kind of work they wanted to do. And he emphasizes this is on page 67. He talks about the general strike as not being just about slavery or not just about the Confederacy. He said it was a strike against the conditions of work to stop the economy of the plantation system. This is going to be incredibly important. To stop the economy of the plantation system. They were willing to work and did work, but they wanted land to work, and they wanted to see the results of their toil. So there you go from this sort of maybe defensive, insistence that, well, no, people did want to work, to a qualitative transformation that says, but you know what, like people want to work for themselves, right? They want to work on their own land. They want to work in a way that allows them to see the benefits of their own labor, right? And there's a couple of really important pieces here. This is a very, very striking parallel to, again, the Haitian Revolution and also some of the shortcomings of the Haitian Revolution, right? The fact that the plantation system itself wasn't dismantled quickly enough, right? The fact that people rose up in Haiti against the plantation system, and the new state told them they had to keep working on plantations, right? And militarized that labor, actually. This was one of the main contradictions and tensions, but you see the same exact thing playing out in the aftermath, of course, of the U.S. Civil War. So you see this question of this, we'll talk more about it in a second, of what it means to sort of work for yourself in a strike against the plantation system. And the last very important strategic piece is that the general strike is what forces Lincoln's hand. And we'll come back to this. I mean, this is definitely something that we'll come back to and state and restate. Again, Lincoln, if he could have kept the Union together with slavery, he would have done it. That was his fundamental goal. And if he needed to abolish slavery to keep the Union together, then that's also something he would do, because that was his primary concern. On page 82, Du Bois writes, in August, Lincoln faced the truth front forward, and the truth was not simply that Negroes ought to be free. It was that thousands of them were already free, right? Thousands of them were already free. Meaning, again, Lincoln didn't free the slaves. Lincoln recognized the established fact of their freedom that they had taken themselves through the course of the general strike, right? And that's not even the end of the importance of what Du Bois is saying, because what Lincoln is recognizing is not only that people are already free and they've freed themselves, but that the North cannot win the war without them, right? Cannot win the war without them as soldiers, and cannot win the war without them, in part because this is something that we will, I think, return to, because European states were about to recognize the Confederacy, right? Those European states wanted access to that cotton. One of the main things that forced Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation is that if he conceded that this was a war against slavery, it made it very hard for abolitionist states in Europe to then engage in direct trade with the South. It would have looked very bad for France and England to recognize the Confederacy and to prioritize their relationships with the Confederacy if that meant embracing the cause of slavery. Because those were already abolitionist countries, their working classes were already abolitionist, and they had forced abolition, right? So this was part of what forces Lincoln's hand to ultimately then, a couple of years later, January 1863, issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So by their own action, enslaved people freed themselves and set into motion a vast transformation of what the war meant and of the outcome of the war. Who won, right? The general strike is the source of all of that transformation. And that's why this chapter is so incredibly important. Again, this is probably obvious by now, but when Du Bois says general strike, in this context, this is a controversial thing to say. This is a term that's usually reserved for wage labor in highly developed capitalist societies working in industrial, settings, in factories, right? As we already saw with the category of the black worker and the white worker, Du Bois is transforming Marxism by deploying the categories in a certain way. He's saying, no, these are workers. Here's why we need to understand their centrality. Now he's saying this is a general strike, right? And so on the one hand, of course, he's transforming the content of what a general strike means by saying that, that it includes and incorporates enslaved people, not only wage labor. He's expanding our category of the working class and the proletariat to include those enslaved within capitalism, right? And for the furtherance and expansion of capitalism. But he's also, and this is one of the important subtexts of this chapter, I think, he's also transforming the general strike because, again, he's not understanding the general strike as something that's programmatic, that's planned, that's communicated, that's organized by a specific organization, right? He's incorporating an understanding of the necessary spontaneity that, at least in this context, was crucial for the way that this general strike played out, right? It's something that's based more and anchored in the individual structural relations of individuals to the system, their decision-making, the way that those individual decisions, the swarm, again, as he puts it in that contradictory term, swarm of individual decisions constitute a sort of general trajectory, right? That's very different in a sort of qualitative way. That's different from how we understand the general strike and the role of spontaneity in that general strike. And there's one more, I think, crucial piece that I want to add before we move on to sort of a broader conversation and more questions, which is the fact that Du Bois traces a very specific trajectory, right, when he talks about the general strike, which is to say he talks about the economic centrality of enslaved people, right, the fact that this is the heart of the capitalist system, the fact that these black workers engaged in a general strike and walked off the plantation, and that they went to Union lines and that they joined the Union Army and that they fought to defeat the Confederacy. And all of those things are true, but that is not all of the story, right? Like, that's only part of it. And there are important elements of the story that can be obscured when that is the sort of arc of the narrative. That was Du Bois's narrative because he's telling the story in a certain way. But we should just be aware of, and we need to be aware of, what kind of falls out when we tell the story in that kind of way. What falls out in particular is that the economic centrality of enslaved people was the centrality for capitalism, right? By that I mean, that wasn't the kind of labor or the organization of labor that enslaved people would have chosen to be doing, right? That's not the entirety of the economic possibility, right? The enslaved person was not only a worker for capital, in other words, a worker for exchange value on the market, but also potentially a worker for use value. In other words, a worker for the things that people need, right? All of what this does, and this comes through, important critiques, from particularly, not even critiques, but contributions, right? Collaborations from Angela Davis to sort of others. This is an incredibly important book, very recent book for people that don't know it, The Emancipation Circuit by Tulani Davis. What this book does so well is to say, well, what else did enslaved people do, or formerly enslaved people do, when they walked off the plantation, right? Because they didn't just go join the Union Army. They built camps. They engaged in democratic debate and discussion in those camps. They developed a new public sphere, a Black public sphere, in and around these camps, according to Tulani Davis. In other words, all of these questions open out on what I would understand as being what's outside of the capitalist enslaved system, right? Angela Davis, in this great essay written while in prison in 1971, emphasizes the role of women in particular in the community of slaves. But part of what she's saying is, listen, like, as there was this struggle going on against slavery, right? There was community being built in the background, right? And that community, that social reproduction, is a huge part of how that resistance can even happen in the first place. And it's the space where use values are consumed, right? It's the space where people are producing what they want and what they need instead of what the market needs, right? All of that is also to say that, people that, enslaved people that walked off the plantation were not just members of the Union Army, right? The trajectory wasn't simply to then go defend this other government, but to build something very, very different, right? And to transform again in the course of that, of that progression. And Du Bois gives hints of this, and people have probably seen, the pieces in here where he's talking about these, what he calls socialistic experiments in self-managed economies, right? In Louisiana, there's the, Sherman's Sea Island Circular, where he distributes a lot of land on the Sea Islands to formerly enslaved people. That's eventually taken away. But these are all pointing toward the kind of higher aspiration, which was to build something very, very different outside of and against this system. And if it's not clear, I'll try to say it just one more time, which is that we run the risk of enclosing formerly enslaved people into the trajectory that leads them into the Union as part of the US government, right? A part of an attempt to reform the US government and to reform capitalism, instead of also trying to build something different, which was always the point, right? And again, that's why the attack on the plantation is crucial, right? Because, spoiler alert, the plantation will not go away, right? The plantation as a structure will persist. It will take different forms. Sharecropping will become the mechanism of managing a labor force on sort of the reconstituted plantations, right? And the promise of land redistribution, right, 40 acres on a mule, will never come true. And if it had, we would have had a very, very different history in the U.S. South. Now, if we look at the end of the chapter, because we always look at the beginning and we always look at the end. Du Bois sort of tips his hat toward, in interesting ways, toward two chapter titles that will be coming sort of ahead. This is at the top of 83. The guns at Sumter, the marching armies, the fugitive slaves, the fugitives as contraband, spies, servants, and laborers, the Negro as soldier, as citizen, as voter. These steps came from 1861 to 1868 with regular beat that was almost rhythmic. It was the price of the disaster of war. And it was a price that few Americans at first dreamed of paying or wanted to pay. So the first, and this is a chapter further down in the book, is the price of disaster, the price of the disaster of war, right? What that's going to mean for Du Bois is those rights that Black people are going to demand and be finally given through struggle as a sort of repayment for having saved the nation in war, right? That's the price of the disaster of war. And as Du Bois emphasizes, it's a price Americans did not want to pay. White Americans did not want to pay. The second is further down, and it's in the song lyrics that Du Bois, of course, in a very sort of trademark fashion, ends the chapter with. He says, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. The next chapter is called The Coming of the Lord. And again, at the sort of risk of being annoying, just think about what the coming of the Lord means. It's very straightforward. The coming of the Lord means blank, because that's something that's going to become clear in the next chapter. And specifically think in terms of the two questions that I've given you all on the schedule, which is, what does it mean to fight, and who was emancipation for? The coming of the Lord is the chapter about Black soldiers. And it's very much a chapter about this sort of like, I've mentioned the kind of master-slave dialectic in Hegel before, where it's this question of how struggle is crucial to transforming self-consciousness on an individual and a collective way. This is something we see in many different variants. We see it in Fanon today, in sort of anti-colonial struggles in the present. Du Bois is going to be thinking very, very hard about this question of, what did it mean when he said that for, that victory in the war meant Black soldiers, but Black soldiers meant freedom, right? What does it mean? What is the connection between fighting and struggle and freedom? That's something I definitely want you all to think about for next week. But for now, let's take more questions about this chapter on the general strike.
So we have a question from the chat.
Mm-hmm.
How does political whiteness become the factor between the North and South, which makes them not understand the fugitive slave and those Black men that fought with Brown? Like John Brown, I think.
Can you repeat it?
How does political whiteness become the factor between the North and South, which makes them not understand the fugitive slave and those Black men that fought with John Brown?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is about political whiteness, meaning whiteness understood as a political category. What is the role of that in making it hard for both the North and the South to understand the importance of Black struggle, Black working class struggle? This is straightforwardly what Du Bois refers to as the American blind spot. He sometimes phrases it broadly as the American blind spot toward race. It roughly in that context means like racism and what it prevents you from understanding and seeing. But then he also understands it more narrowly as the inability, for example, of white unionized labor in the North to understand enslaved people in the South as labor, right? So the racial blind spot in there prevents the understanding that this is also a labor struggle. That's what he means it, as in a more specific way. And again, we talked about the fact that there's this sort of inverse misunderstanding where abolitionists were against slavery, but they were also not anti-capitalist, right? So there was this mutual misunderstanding and missed encounter between what he calls two labor movements, abolition on one hand, and kind of unionized working class on the other. So that's the key function of political whiteness in disrupting that relationship, right? But it plays out in far broader senses. And I, always think about the ways in which, I come from a political trajectory that drew very heavily on an organization called the Sojourner Truth Organization in the 1970s, which was like a communist, anti-racist communist organization. And two of the, great contributors to that organization, Ted Allen and Noel Ignatieff, reconfigured what Du Bois calls the American blind spot into what they just called the white blind spot. Because they were writing in the 60s and they were saying, listen, like, labor unions are misunderstanding the importance of Black labor struggle, right? And more important than that, and this is a point that C.L.R. James would make repeatedly, which is that non-labor struggles, right, by Black communities were also labor struggles, also working class struggles, also carried working class content, right? In the same way that we say today, and we have to keep saying, struggles against police brutality and violence are working class struggles, right? And that should be obvious, but it's not obvious because of this, this sort of wedge, of whiteness and even like normative whiteness, right? The normative whiteness of a labor struggle, right? Which is to say, this is what a labor struggle should look like to be considered properly a labor struggle. So that's what I would say to that. What else do we have? My voice has survived. I thought it was going to collapse a lot sooner, but.
How different was the understanding of enslavement, not just between the North and the South, but between poor whites in the North and rich whites. Like, I'm thinking from a union perspective, like privates versus, commanding officers. Does that make sense? Because I've read a lot of letters from like correspondences
Yeah.
between like lower level officers and sergeants, and they're like complete dismay with how slavery was upheld in the South because they had not been introduced to it, right? And a lot of them are also like, conscript immigrants during the latter half of the war. And like,
You mean appalled when they saw it? Appalled
yes,
when they realized
it changed. It had a
sure.
fundamental changing of their understanding of race in a way. Some of the letters I've read,
In the sense that they were outraged by it.
yes,
Got it. Check. I just want to be clear. Yeah, no, I mean that sounds that sort of tracks for me. But the flip side of that is that, like, quite literally, what was happening is a series of draft riots, right? In which poor white people in the North were saying, we don't want to go fight this war. And they identified, they engaged in a sort of racial affixation of blame for that war to black people, right? And so they were attacking and killing and murdering black people in the North because they thought they were being asked to go fight a war on their behalf, right? Again, this is directly connected to what we talked about a few weeks ago, which is the fundamental misunderstanding of thinking that your competition in this world is those individuals as opposed to the entirety of that slave system, which drives down wages, which weakens labor, which weakens working class struggles, which is the entire point of the racialization of that structure, right? So yeah, no, I think there's two of those things happening. I don't think they're contradictory in the sense that once someone enters the South and sees what's happening and engages with it in a more direct way, that would be the reaction. But from the very outset, and again, this is cultivated, right? There are people that would rather have you focus your anger on, black people in the North than on the broader, structure of inequality that governs your life, right? So, yeah, I think that's 100% true.
Another question from the chat. In what other historical context do you have such a shift happening in just 2 years? Du Bois is definitely successful in countering the belief of some readers and many histories of the period.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, in a way, if I take it, the question is this kind of dramatic shift in meaning something that is very particular, or is this something that happens often throughout history? I think it's something that, well, I don't know. I wouldn't say it happens often, but what I will say, and I think what's important to say, is that when these dramatic shifts in meaning happen, the source is the same, right? The source is a kind of rebellious power and energy that comes from the bottom rung of society, right? It's when, and again, I mentioned Venezuela earlier when I was talking about this kind of blind spot. We just passed the anniversary of it a few days ago, in 1989, a mass rebellion on February 27th. Again, rich elites didn't see it coming. Afterwards, everyone was like, well, yeah, that was obviously going to happen. And it was built and premised upon the invisibility of those sort of poor and sort of racialized sectors that didn't count, right? That moment set into motion the entirety of Venezuelan society. It reconfigured those boundaries. It transformed the political party system. It reconfigured the boundaries of who was part of politics and not. It was the origin moment of what we understand as the Bolivarian Revolution. And it all comes from a moment of mass rebellion, right? You see that across Latin America. You see that across third world struggles and struggles against oppression, where it's when people take dramatic and radical action into their own hands, right? That's when meanings begin to change. Fanon has a really incredible book about the Algerian Revolution. I mean, many incredible books about the Algerian Revolution. But my favorite is always A Dying Colonialism. And what's so amazing about A Dying Colonialism is that it's all about this transformation of meaning. There's a chapter, very famously, people maybe have seen the chapter on the veil. There's a chapter on the radio, like radio technology. There's a chapter on Western medicine. There's a chapter on the French language. And what he does in every single one of these chapters, the Algerian family, in every one of these chapters, he shows how whatever it is that he's analyzing fundamentally shifts its meaning in the course of the Algerian Revolution, right? Nothing has a fixed meaning, right? They're all subject to the dynamism of that struggle, right? So he shows the ways in which we, for example, are told that the veil in, Islamic society means oppression. He says, no, it could mean that, and it could mean the opposite. And there's moments where it definitely means the opposite in the course of the revolution, because the French are saying you need to take off your veils. And so Algerian women are saying, you know what? That means I'm going to put it on, and I'm going to use it to carry bombs, and I'm going to use it to resist and fight back, right? The same thing with the family structure, right? There's no, against this kind of ossification that says that these sort of historical and cultural artifacts are fixed and eternal. He sees them as always capable of being set into motion through mass struggle, right? And so that's really, for me, a really good example of these moments and these dynamics that really allow meaning to shift. I think we just have to be aware of it and attentive to it. I think we did have more questions over here. Did you have one? Yeah.
Thank you. This is so cute. I just wanted to say thank you so much for pointing out the fact that Black people were the first to launch a general strike.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Black people emancipated themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's such it's such a myth. And there's so many stories out there regarding Black people and their own liberation. And, I'm just thinking about even the resistance and how Black people from as far as Missouri, here in Pennsylvania and all over, well, not Pennsylvania, but in the South, were able to free themselves and created movements of resistance together without even knowing each other from all of these distant lands. And that's because as people and as a person who identifies as Black, that is truly our ways. It was our way of knowing. It was our ancestors. It's always said that our ancestors were communicating to us, and it had to be spiritual in order for all of us to realize at that moment there had to be some type of movement of resistance without even speaking to each other, because we were so distant and so apart, but we all came from the same land, the same ancestors, the same soil. And so at that time, it kind of reunited us again. And it's not surprising to most of us that we knew how to join the army to free ourselves and how to take up space, because we knew really that the Union was not fighting on our behalf. We knew that. We understood that. We may not have been able to read and write, and some of us in that way, but we knew that this war was not about our humanity. So I appreciate the fact that you pointed that out the way that you did, because I think that that is a huge part that's often missing from these conversations.
Well, thank you so much. That's a really, really important point. And it's something that'll come up more in the next chapter, but it also raises there's a few interesting things. One is there's this article came out just a couple of years ago that's super interesting. Not only is this general strike a general strike in the most important and even more radical sense than we often understand the term general strike, but there's a sort of historical research article that came out about how it was actually a formerly enslaved Black person that can be credited with even coming up with the very first idea of the general strike long prior to this, right? And, it was in the context of the Caribbean, and the way that idea was then picked up by European labor is a very, very interesting one. And so, and then fast forward, right, to this moment, which is, we're talking about the 1870s. What's happening in the 1870s in Europe? The Paris Commune is happening, right? But even to this day, when we think about socialist struggles, revolutionary struggles, when we think about, we center the Paris Commune as the example of communes, right? As the example of socialist struggle in this moment, when, again, Du Bois is showing, other people, Noel Ignatieff, who I already mentioned, who wrote this whole article saying, listen, this was the commune. The South Carolina commune was what we're talking about, right? And yet we can't see, we'd rather look across the ocean and see what's happening in Paris as the example when we can't look 500 miles south to South Carolina, right? And that is a hugely important example of the blind spot that Du Bois is talking about, right? Why is that not legible, right? And there are lots of different reasons, one of which is kind of straightforwardly racial. Another one, though, has to do with this question of spontaneity in the form that this takes, right? That makes it less legible. And again, we could dig this all the way into sort of Western European epistemology and certain understandings of hyper-rationalism and the idea that organization looks a certain kind of way as opposed to another kind of way, right? But one key aspect that I think you point toward and that Du Bois is always talking about, right, when we're talking about the coming of the Lord, he's going to talk about the coming of the Lord in very complicated terms, right? And it's not, still to this day, it's not clear to me on what level he identifies himself with formerly enslaved people who are having this kind of absolute religious experience of ecstasy in emancipation, right? Because Du Bois is also very rational. He's very sort of like, composed in this kind of way. And yet he's someone who's always aware of and attentive to the way that spirituality is not just about religion, if that makes sense, right? The way that spirituality was a mode of coded language, right? That spirituals were guidance for, like, literal maps for how to escape were built into spiritual songs, right? And that this was used as a way to sort of guide resistance in a context in which you couldn't state that straightforwardly, right? It's a kind of hidden transcript of what's necessary to resist on a subterranean level. So I think that's incredibly, crucial. Thank you so much.
So many questions in the chat. What lessons can we take as abolitionists from the period described by Du Bois in this specific chapter?
What lessons can we take from Du Bois as abolitionists from this specific chapter? This specific chapter is about mass action, right? This specific chapter is about, very narrowly, right, about who is in charge of the dynamic of history. And in a general sense, we could say oppressed people, dispossessed people are in charge of that dynamic of history because through mass action, they can set it into motion. More specifically, in this case, of course, we're talking about enslaved people, right? That's a crucial piece of it, right? Now, I respond to the question in the way that it's posed, right? Because it says in this chapter, because we're going to be looking at different pieces throughout that are all relevant to the present, right? And we've already sort of foregrounded the fact that, like, the question of Reconstruction, the failures of Reconstruction, is one of the most important ones for thinking about today, right? And, in between those, sort of in the sandwich of this sort of massive sandwich of a book, is going to be this question of race and class, which we've been threading throughout, right? And again, that's massively present, right? It's not only defining of the past 9 years, but it's going to be defining of the next sort of 10 at least, right? Which is to say, on what level are poor white people going to sacrifice themselves over and over again to a system that does not benefit them, right? As they're dying en masse from drug overdoses and poverty-related diseases, and yet they're still supporting the system, right? They're still selling out their interests. So there's lots there, but this one is very much about mass action, right? And the power of mass action to transform meaning. Do we have any more?
I have I have two questions that kind of, I think, play into each other, and one is about what you were saying about ancestral knowledge and communications among people who don't have a way to communicate with each other, and something that you had said about the spiritual telegram, I think, or telegraph that you had said. The first part of it is, I'm curious, like, the larger cultural context of enslaved people outside of the United States that was happening at this time, and how people were learning from each other in some way. Because you mentioned Haiti, they mentioned the West Indies here, and some of it is just like logistically the timeline of what was going on that I have questions about, but also how those movements supported each other or how they were different from each other. And my second one is kind of about what you were just saying about, because there's like the contradiction. Where did he say it? It's the contradiction of the poor white folks, basically. That, hold on, I'm gonna find it. It's on, yeah, page 80 and 81. The contradiction of, so it was like, as slavery hardened, the racial basis was emphasized, but it wasn't until the war that it became the fashion to pat the disenfranchised poor white man on the back and tell him, after all, he was white, and he was a part of keeping the white man superior. But then on the very next page, he says that the poor whites were losing faith. They saw that poverty was fighting the war, not wealth. So my question there is why we heard what was happening in the North and why there wasn't class solidarity there, but in the South, once the poor white folks saw and really genuinely learned that they were a part of the folks that the planters like wanted to oppress as well, what was the reason for not moving towards class solidarity even after all of that? And then also I'm curious what class solidarity among the poor white folks in those other countries outside of the United States, what that looked like amongst them and enslaved Black people.
That's such a great series of questions. On the first one, I think it's really important. And you're asking, I like the way you're asking, outside of the US, how do things look different, right? How do things look different in terms of this relationship between knowledge and communication? And again, built into that is this conversation we're having around class consciousness. Like, how is it that you become aware as a collective and engage in struggle? Again, the Haitian Revolution begins with a religious ceremony, right? But we make a mistake if we interpret that religious ceremony as being narrowly about religion and faith, because the point of the ceremony was resistance. The point of the ceremony was the overturning of the world. And that's exactly what they did, right? One important piece, though, in Haiti on the question of communication in particular, because again, this is all, I read this through the way that Marxism understands class consciousness, right? Again, the working class develops class consciousness because they're forced together into a factory that sits them down next to each other and makes them do the same routine tasks all the time. And so creates its own gravediggers because it's creating the basis for them to, of course, communicate with each other, right? It's putting them into contact and putting them into communication. So there's something about the concentration there that is crucial to consciousness. As we said, one of the main differences between the US South and the Caribbean islands was this lack of concentration of enslaved people, right? Which made it more difficult to resist, more difficult to communicate, which is why C.L.R. James in The Black Jacobin says and describes these plantations in Haiti as great sugar factories of the Northern Plain, right? A huge part of what he's saying, and he even says they were more proletarian than the proletarians in Europe at the time, because they were so concentrated, because they understood their condition, because on top of being reduced to the same condition, they were literally reduced by race to the same condition, right? And so there's a huge difference between the kind of communication that can then happen, right? This is still, of course, very much a less than literate society, right? So it's not so much about that, but it is about communication, interpersonal communication, religious communication. And there are very interesting dynamics that James then highlights in The Black Jacobins about the fact that, like, say, Toussaint Louverture was privileged and well-educated, right? And there are interesting and contradictory ways in which that prepares him to do the work that he did for the revolution, right? He's also someone, very interestingly, that waits and watches and does not join the revolution right away, right? He doesn't throw himself into the revolution. He's very, very hesitant in a way that echoes what Du Bois is saying. So the situation in Haiti is very, very different. And there's one more thing that I would say about communication, and that's that there's like it's increasingly becoming clear how important Islam was to slave rebellions in the Western Hemisphere. And again, not strictly as a religion, but as an organizing principle and framework for thinking about the world and communicating with each other, right? It turns out that it was incredibly central for Palmares, which is the biggest Colombo in Brazil, which had like 10,000 people living together in the jungle. And it was sort of neglected as an important factor until, relatively recently. All of which points to, and again, I'm actually surprised this is the first time that it's come up, but it points toward like some very severe limitations of what we could take to be the kind of Afro-pessimistic approach to understanding slavery in the US, which thinks that US slavery, first of all, is very specific. It's the highest expression of the sort of absolute negation of the humanity of enslaved people, but that as a result erases all of the content of those people, right? Enslaved people in the US are presented as if they arrive as a kind of pure negativity with no cultural, historical, linguistic, religious content, right? And that's just not true, right? People are bringing all of these very many different pieces. One of the very important conflicts that plays out in Haiti is between sort of, Haitian-born enslaved people and what were referred to as bosales, who were people who were African-born, right? Because people who were African-born were less likely to accept the shit that was happening, right? And they were more likely to fight back and to have frameworks and categories for that. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind, that this question also raises the question of what kind of content people always bring kind of with them. On the question, the sort of transnational question of well, there's two pieces, right? On the transnational piece, right? Why didn't, what was going on with poor whites in other parts? I think it's very, very different. In the Caribbean, there weren't that many, right? I mean, there were some. They were much more likely to be incorporated into the power structure. They were massacred, right, as they should have been, because of, not for racial reasons, but for political reasons. CLR James says, like, the whites were the whites of the old regime, right? Again, this is a political category of race. They were trying to reinstitute slavery, and so they didn't last. The question of the incorporation becomes a lot more complicated other places in the Spanish Americas, and there are always these attempts to kind of like divide and play them off each other. But what's very interesting, about your question as well, is when you point to the sort of contradictory dynamic of them being incorporated into whiteness, but they were also losing faith, right? Again, that makes perfect sense, because they're being incorporated because the system is collapsing, right? Or they're being incorporated because they're needed to uphold the system. But the main issue, I think, is that, there's a couple, right? One is that, like, racism is a hell of a drug, right? Which is that it made them feel good, right? Like, they did buy into this on a certain level. There were, again, material and psychological privileges that went along with it. But that, even as Du Bois mentions, right, the main alternative, like, they could go west and they could go north, right? So if they were really that fed up with the system, they would go look for land, right? Or they would move north. And so that kind of escape valve, I think, prevents the development of a major sort of poor white rebellion. But that's the story of the whole book, right? Is that we're going to see the ways in which this existing antagonism of poor whites toward the planters could have reached boiling points and did in certain moments, but never to the point that it really threatened the system, right? Without that sort of broader alliance. One more question is great, and then I'm going to pass out.
So last question of the night. Were poor whites folded at all into the reorganizing of the plantation system?
Oh, that's really interesting. Not at this point, no. I mean, so we don't want to speak in kind of absolutes, right? Enslaved people are walking off. Poor whites are suddenly, necessary as a labor force, which is weird for poor whites because they hadn't been a labor force, right? Part of what, again, people that weren't here in the earlier sessions, Du Bois emphasized the fact that poor whites lived in absolute and total squalor and barbarism. They lived materially worse than many enslaved people, but it was because they were literally not part of the economy, right? The economy was built around slavery. They were not enslaved people, so they were on the side, right? And they were trying to just scrape out a living, doing whatever they could. Sometimes that meant working within as overseers, as slave breakers. But for the most part, no. One of the main tensions and contradictions that then emerges is, how is this going to be reorganized after emancipation, right? And here there's a tension and a contradiction within the poor white, because the poor white wants to aspire to be a planter and be a large landowner, but that's very unlikely, right? To put it lightly. And so in the short term, there are these moments and struggles where poor whites are actually trying to displace Black people, right? To become the labor force. They actually want to break their way into labor, right? They want access to those jobs. And so then you see the sort of reproduction of a kind of like intra-working class conflict, but it plays out in very interesting ways in the different sort of Reconstruction constitutions, right? And the way that the political dynamics plays out. Again, Du Bois will map out by state, right? What majority of the population, what percentage of the population was Black, poor white, planters. What did this create in terms of a power dynamic, and on what level were the class antagonisms either directly expressed or kind of muted and diffused? But that's going to be very, very interesting, right? This question of poor whites struggling to displace Black labor and become the labor force is a story that's coming over the next 5 to 10 years. Yeah. Cool. Thank you all so much. I'll see you next week for the coming of the Lord. Mm-hmm.